Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner. This is the 2022 Tour de France breakdown and what you should expect to see in next year's fabulous Tour de France. Now, the race organizers did an absolutely marvelous job of setting up a great parcours for us to enjoy and watch, and we do not have to wait till stage 9 or 10 to get into the big mountains to see the big battles with the GC favorites. This year, when it starts up in Denmark with the time trial, then followed by 2 flatter stages, it's going to be crazy, hectic, and absolutely insane. So make sure you're tuning in for those first 3 days. Now, there's a rest day, so you can take a break on the rest day just like the riders can, but then you better get ready to get back on your couch because the excitement starts again as soon as we get in France. They're going to start racing by the coast, so if there's any kind of wind, it's going to be an insane day. And if the first 4 stages weren't enough, stage 5, when we get back onto the cobblestones, you definitely are going to have to tune in because we all saw this year's Paris-Roubaix how exciting it was. So we know at next year's Tour de France on stage 5, when they get into the cobblestones, it's going to be absolutely insane and crazy to watch. Last time when I did the Tour de France 2014, we had the cobblestone, same thing. I believe it was stage 5 and raining and miserable conditions. Now, I'm 50-50 on cobblestones in the Tour de France. Okay, I personally don't believe they should be there, but I personally love to watch it, love to spectate it, love to watch it, and I love to race it. I got to do it 2 times in the Tour de France, once with Radio Shack, and of course, like I told you, once with Lamprey. Now, the problem is with them, when you have massive crashes, you might lose a big GC favorite. And then, of course, we lose the excitement of watching a big GC battle when we're talking later in the Tour de France. When we look at teams like UAE Team Emirates with Tadej Pogačar, the legendary rider from 2021, absolutely spectacular from start to finish of the season. When we look at stage 5 on the Roubaix, on the cobblestones, Tadej Pogačar's team is not going to be a force there to really look after him, but we all know Tadej Pogačar can look after himself. He's absolutely fabulous. Now, the problem is when you get on the cobblestones, if it's wet and crazy and miserable and there's crashes everywhere, he might not have teammates with him. UAE Team Emirates have done a fabulous job of adding the Portuguese rider João Almeida to the team. So when we start looking at the climbing stages, when we start looking at this Paris-Roubaix stage, Almeida might be a factor when we're talking about Paris-Roubaix, but we don't really know that for sure. And I would say probably less likely than more likely to be a big factor in helping Tadej Pogačar out on the cobblestones day. But we all know João Almeida, if he's one of the riders there at the Tour de France looking after Tadej Pogačar for UAE Team Emirates, if he's on form, he could be a spectacular help for Tadej Pogačar. They added Marc Soler from Movistar, and they added George Bennett from Jumbo-Visma. So when we're talking about UAE Team Emirates in the mountains, they look fantastic. But when we're talking about the cobblestone stage, on stage 5, this is the most crucial stage for Tadej Pogačar and UAE Team Emirates to look after their leader and make sure everything is spot on. If I'm directing for UAE Team Emirates, I want all my riders to have already previewed this course, seeing how you enter all the cobblestones and what you're looking at for the best possible line when you get into the cobbles, because they're insane. And if it's raining like we saw this year, anything is possible. Now we go in and let's talk about Jumbo-Visma, because the Jumbo-Visma have their own problems too. We're talking about Primož Roglič, legendary rider, as close to the best rider in the world as I could possibly make him, but Tadej Pogačar still the best. Primož Roglič, though, has got to worry about this stage too. Now, he has the complete opposite team when we're talking about UAE Team Emirates. He has a force to reckon with. I mean, they are absolutely beautiful because we're talking about Wout van Aert is on Jumbo-Visma. But here's the problem. Wout van Aert's talked about many times about wanting to race for the green jersey. We know he wants to win stages. And so on stage 5, on the most crucial stage of the 2022 Tour de France, will he look after Primož Roglič, or are we going to see like in the 2021 Tour de France where Wout van Aert is on the right side of the road, Primož Roglič is on the left crashing and ending his 2021 Tour de France? So Paris-Roubaix, when we're talking about the cobbles, And we're talking about Wout van Aert. We all know he can win Paris-Roubaix. We all know he can win this Stage 5 on the cobblestones. But is he going to be going for the win, or is he going to look after Primož Roglič? In my book, right now, if I'm the director at Jumbo-Visma, I'm telling Wout van Aert, you have to look after Primož Roglič because we want to win this Tour de France. And we know in order to win, we need Primož Roglič 100%. If he's 100%, I believe fighting with Tadej Pogačar, he could possibly win the Tour de France. Absolutely, no doubt. I see those two so even that if Tadej Pogačar lost 0.5%, Primož Roglič gains 0.5%, we're talking about a different Slovenian winning the Tour de France. So this cobblestone stage is absolutely crucial. Now I'm going to bring in one other factor because we saw this year with Mark Cavendish, when riders return back to their old glory teams, like Mark Cavendish did with the Kuna Quickstep and then win spectacular stages at this year's Tour de France. Now I'm going to bring up the old veteran Vincenzo Nibali, the Italian rider. Okay, 2014. I want to point something out about 2014 on the Cobblestone Day because Vincenzo Nibali had already been in the race leader's yellow jersey, and now we get on the cobblestone stage here at 2014. When Vincenzo Nibali was riding for Astana, they dominated every cobblestone section there was. Guys, I was there watching it. They were absolutely blowing the race apart and dominated this race from the first cobblestone all the way to the last, all the way to the finish line. And Vincenzo Nibali on this stage stamped an authority on about his dominance of the 2014 Tour de France and how he was going to win everything. Now, Vincenzo Nibali, Trek Segafredo rider this year, but going back to his old Astana team for next year, the same team in 2014 that he dominated the Tour de France with. Let me remind you, he hasn't done a whole lot in 2 years, but in 2019, he won the last mountain stage of the Tour de France that year and won it solo and kept the time. His whole time when he was solo, he was in the break, of course, but when he dropped all the riders at the beginning of the climb, he kept the gap to all the GC favorites back there all the way to the finish to win that last mountain stage of the Tour de France. Since then, it's easy to say Vincenzo Nibali's washed up. We haven't seen great results from him, and that's true. The last 2 years haven't been spectacular from Vincenzo Nibali, but there's been a lot of things going on in 2020 and, of course, a lot of things going on in 2021. So we'll see with Vincenzo Nibali if he goes back to the cobblestone stage and stage 5 of next year's Tour de France. We will know on that stage whether or not if we're going to see the 4-time Grand Tour champion be able to compete with the two Slovenians and any other favorites at the 2022 Tour de France. That's the beautiful thing about stage 5 of next year's Tour de France. We don't have to wait till 8, 9, 10 stage to figure out who is in top form. No one of the GC favorites on this stage 5 can afford to lose time. In my belief, I don't believe anyone's ever lost 5, 4, 3 minutes back there and still won the Tour de France. So stage 5 is a must tune in. Now we're talking about later on in the Tour de France, we have the Alpe d'Huez stage when we get into the Alps. So it's going to be a fabulous mountain stage. When I did it my very first year with Lotto, I was sick and injured, and I remember thinking the 4 days before that, every day I was suffering like crazy. One stage, I dropped 12 pounds in that stage. That's how sick I was, and I could see every vein and muscle in my feet when I took my shoes off as they were cramping up on me. But Alpe d'Huez is a legendary climb, and I kept fighting through all those sick days to get myself to Alpe d'Huez. And every stage that I was fighting, I was like, just make it to Alpe d'Huez so that you can do the mythical climb that is so amazing. Because the last thing you want to do is show up at the Tour de France and then come back home and tell everyone you didn't make it to Alpe d'Huez and, oh, you never rode Alpe d'Huez in your career. So there's a lot of motivations. That climb is absolutely special. Now, in terms of how hard it is compared to other climbs, when we're talking about Oudacam that comes in the last week of the Tour de France, I don't think it's any harder. But because of the mystery behind it, because of all the history there, because of the winners who have won at Alpe d'Huez, you just always want to be a part of that. So you know everyone's going to be motivated when we're talking about Alpe d'Huez stage. The breaks are going to be trying to get up the road and win that way. And of course, all the favorites behind want to say they won on Alpe d'Huez too, so it's going to be an exciting stage. The last week of the Tour de France leaves a lot for us to stay tuned in for. Oudacom is coming, and it's going to be a great battle on that because it's one of the last mountain stages, and it's a summit finish, so nothing is going to be held back on Oudacom because, of course, we're going to have a time trial with 2 days to go that's going to decide the Tour de France. So Oudacom with Tadej Pogačar, if he's still in the Tour de France, nobody's time gap is safe if Tadej Pogačar is within a minute or two of any position on the Tour de France in terms of trying to win. We saw last year when Tadej Pogačar won the Tour de France on the last TT, taking it from Primož Roglič and bringing back a minute's time. I mean, he was flying in that TT. So even Primož Roglič knows he does not want to go into the last time trial of next year's Tour de France without a significant margin. So the Oudacom climb is going to be fantastic to tune in for, and we got a lot to watch. Other things to keep in mind. Normally, Bora Hansgrohe will light up every medium mountain stage and non-flat sprinter stage. Anything that's not a summit climb or a complete flat stage, Bora Hansgrohe, we're talking 2 years ago, lit up every climbing stage in the Tour de France that wasn't a summit and it wasn't monster big out of category climbs. This year, though, remember, Peter Sagan is no longer with Bora Hansgrohe. He has left with 2 of his teammates, Daniel Oss and Bonnard. And so when he goes over to the French Total Energies team, it's going to be interesting to see if the French team with Peter Sagan there, if they can do that dominating performance that we saw with Bora Hansgrohe that really kept all those medium mountain stages so exciting for us fans on the couch. It's going to be the big question mark in next year's Tour de France. Along with that has to be Mark Cavendish. Now, can the Deceuninck Quick-Step win with Mark Cavendish, and will Mark Cavendish even make it to the Tour de France team with the Deceuninck Quick-Step? Because remember, they have a lot of force on that team, a lot of quality sprinters, but Mark Cavendish is back. There's no denying that. He dominated last year's Tour de France, winning the green jersey, so you got to believe if he's on the team, they got to take him to the next year's Tour de France. And he's going to have to battle, of course, with all the big sprinters because Sam Bennett should be there. He's going back to Bora Hansgrohe. So we know Sam Bennett will be first on the sprinting list for Bora Hansgrohe to bring to the Tour de France. There's going to be other top quality sprinters there. Of course, we're going to have the Australian Caleb Ewan back in form and hopefully go flying at next year's Tour de France. So Mark Cavendish is going to have to battle against all the best sprinters in the world at next year's Tour de France unless he gets really lucky again and there's some excitement like we saw at this year's Tour de France where he can get away from some of those sprinters with crashes and accidents. We saw last year with Caleb Ewan crashing out on stage 3. We've seen Peter Sagan when he went down with Caleb Ewan. Those were top sprinters being brought out of this year's Tour de France. That next year, Mark Cavendish now is going to have to battle all of them. And let me not forget to talk about Wout van Aert. I brought him up earlier. I told you he's a fantastic rider. But there's going to be times at this year's Tour de France, of course, when Wout van Aert's given the green light. I just got a question. When do you give Wout van Aert the green light when we're talking about Jumbo-Vismas and having Primož Roglič on that team? Again, I know I already brought it up, but Wout van Aert is an amazing rider, and it's necessary to bring him up twice on this Beyond the Coverage edition because Wout van Aert could be the deciding factor on how fantastic this Tour de France is going to be for us at next year's 2022 edition of the Tour de France. If they can keep Wout van Aert working for Primož Roglič throughout the first dangerous part of the week, then I'd give him the green light once we get a little bit into the later part of the Tour de France to start going for these sprint stages. So we're going to look at Wout van Aert now battling in full force. Could be he's battling on the first 3 stages, of course, not the time, well, of course, the time trial, and then stage 2 and 3 for the sprint stages. But in my book, I'd keep him there the whole time with Primož Roglič and keep him out of trouble. But Jumbo-Visma did one other thing. When they brought in Rowan Dennis, now they brought in a guy that can look after Primož Roglič on this first week of flat stages, so Wout van Aert could have the green card. Jumbo-Visma just have to have the knowledge of when you can set Wout van Aert free and when you have to hold him back. When we look at this year's Tour de France and we look at stage 3 in the earlier stages, of course, when Tony Martin crashed with that famous sign, and then stage 3 when they lost Gesink. Once Gesink went down, that was the time 100% to say, Wout van Aert, you have to look after Primoz Roglic. You cannot go for the sprint stages. But when you add Rowan Dennis in there, if you got a strong Rowan Dennis can do that work. He could do it on the flats. He could do it on the medium stages. And we all know he could do it on the big, spectacular mountain stages too. So Wout van Aert, Jumbo-Visma, with the signing of Rowan Dennis, you got to believe there's a little bit more freedom for Wout van Aert to be able to go for all these stages, and properly, rightfully so, he should be able to go for these stages at the end of all the Tour de France sprint stages. If his full team, if the Jumbo-Visma, the other 7 guys on that team have not crashed hard, have not been isolated, have not been put in dangerous positions, then I'm giving Wout van Aert the free card. But, of course, later in the Tour de France, once the stages get a little smoother out and a little more calm after everyone's fallen into their place, then, of course, Wout van Aert could go for stages left and right. Going to be an exciting 2022 Tour de France. Make sure you tune in. I'll break down some of the new team signings. As soon as everything gets a little bit more official, we'll go in there and I'll break down what the positive are of these big teams, who they've signed, who they've lost, have they gotten stronger, have they gotten weaker. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next edition of Beyond the Coverage.